Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Evan Erickson, and I am the host of the Evan Erickson Music Call for Scores. Some of you might have applied, and Chris and I had a blast along with our guest judges, reviewing everyone, and we thought it would be really cool to host kind of this information meeting to make writing for this really cool medium of electronic clarinet more available to composers and, archiving this recording so that people in the future can reference it and have a more detailed log of someone actually explaining like what goes into the notation practices for this instrument and some of the considerations when you're actually performing and like doing the things with the pedals. So Chris is going to take over for about an hour and go through all the different types of pedal effects that can be applied to not just clarinet, but any instrument, basically any acoustic instrument. And we're using clarinet as the medium to do it with. And we'll probably have time for a Q&A at the end, and especially our composers will be commissioning to write for this instrument. Definitely ask questions along the way, and you can message me on the side and I can stop Chris maybe, or yeah, it'll be pretty, it'll go how it goes. And thanks for coming and being here. So your turn, Chris.
Alrighty, let's do this. Well, thank you everyone for signing on to this. I have usually have a blast talking about all of this to people just because I know that there are oftentimes just a lot of questions when people hear this sort of stuff to be like, wow, this is cool, or like, this is a lot of crazy sounds, but like, I have no idea what I would even start off with in terms of like getting into it as a performer or as a composer too, figuring out like, how do I even, what does the sheet music look like for this? Which is a common question that I get for like educational outreach shows. I'll have like students come up and ask to see my sheet music, and I'm like, honestly, guys, it looks pretty normal. There's just a few little things that we'll add in here. Um, and so, just to talk about what we're dealing with first. So, simply put, electroacoustic clarinet, or as I've come to nickname it, FX clarinet, is simply taking everything that we already love about the instrument, its acoustic properties, the uniqueness of its technique and expressive abilities, but we're adding on to it by augmenting the sound with live effects. So, one of the questions I'll always get is like, is this very similar to like an EWI or something like that? And I'll be like, well, no, not quite, because you're not replacing the sound of the instrument. You're keeping the integrity of everything that the instrument is intact. You're just emphasizing it and adding more sonic possibilities to what it can do. Um, and this is one of the things that really excited me when I would listen to like, I think one of the first times I ever heard this sort of thing was honestly with French horn. And I'd gone to see a presentation. Dude's got a full pedal board of effects and he's like playing as front man for a rock band. And I'm like, what am I, is this real? Am I experiencing this right now? Um, and so there's technology out there now that enables pretty much any wind instrument to be able to do this nowadays. So the guy that makes the pickup that I use makes it for like recorder and clarinet and brass instruments, bass clarinet. Pretty much if there's a place to put the pickup on, then you can get it to do similar stuff. Oboe, on the other hand, might be a little bit trickier. Still have to figure out how that works with oboe. But um, to dive into a little bit of how this works in a nutshell, I typically like to explain this in terms of how it works with an electric guitar. So, with an electric guitar, you've got a essentially electromagnetic device underneath the strings called a pickup. And what it's doing is that it's measuring and sensing the vibrations of the strings and converting that into an electrical signal that can then be processed through a number of different effects, from your delay to distortion, pitch shifting, you name it. And then that resulting sound is output through some sort of form of amplification. And so for clarinet, the way that this ends up working is, for most people, when we first experiment with this, oftentimes people use an external microphone to capture the sound, which works as long as that microphone signal is boosted appropriately to the level that it can be handled by the effect pedals. But to make it really easy, then nowadays what's becoming more and more popular is using a barrel pickup. So this is installed onto the barrel of the instrument through a little brass threaded insert here. So what's happening is by putting the pickup in this hole here in the barrel, then I'm able to take the changes in air pressure from inside the instrument and capture the sound in the most direct way possible, rather than fussing about with microphone placement, especially for clarinet, because as many of us probably already know, like the open tone hole concept makes it kind of weird to try and pick up the sound just right that's going to apply these effects evenly across the instrument's entire range. So in this case, this pickup is going to just screw into the barrel, take all the sound from the inside, and then there's a, see if I can get close enough here, just a little 1/8 inch jack that the cable plugs into. And then this runs down into the pedal board of effects that you should see down here in the corner. And now at this point, it just kind of runs exactly like it would an electric guitar. It's all the same pedal effects. It's all the same cabling. So pretty much once I got this installed, it was a matter of like going to Guitar Center and figuring out what kind of equipment to get from there. And of course, getting all sorts of fun puzzled looks from the employees being like, what are you doing with a clarinet? So in this pedal board below here, then each of these are connected by cables. This is not one whole unit. These are each different pedals with a selectability to it. So one of them is just for delay, another is just for distortion, so on and so forth. When I first started off, I think I had like maybe 1 or 2 of these. And so over time, all of these accumulated, and now it's just a mess of different effects back here. But when I have conversations with composers and performers and they want to get into this, but then they look at the pedal board and they're like, what do I even start off with? And I'm like, honestly, just pick one. Like pick 1 or 2 to like really get to know well. And then you can expand what you want to work with from there. So like what we'll talk about is that delay is a really great effect to start off with a lots of different possibilities to it. So just to talk about, how a lot of this came to be for a moment, when we talk about writing for this kind of medium, a lot of people tend to assume that this is a rather new thing, but actually it's been around for quite a long time. So back when, especially electric guitar players were using effect pedals too. So we're talking like around the 60s going into this 1970s, that you would have wind players starting to pick up on it as well. The technology was a little bit more limited at that time, but that didn't stop people like Miles Davis from using a wah pedal in some of his early albums to imitate the sounds of Jimi Hendrix. You would have composers like Bill Smith, who throughout like the 70s and 80s would write loads of stuff for clarinet and delay system. Or there's a piece of his called Slow Motion, which is like a bunch of different like synthesizer style effects like piled on together, and that's a wild set of sounds. And you can hear some of these experiments being done as early as this late 60s, 70s, and 80s. Though what's cool is that, starting at around like getting into the 2000s, people start to really pick up an interest in this again, especially with things like barrel pickups advancing in terms of technology. And now people are starting to have more accessibility to this side of clarinet performance. And so now we're here, and now we're wondering like, how do we write for it? How do performers feel about doing this sort of stuff? And so when I'm talking to performers about this, I usually try and keep it as simple as I possibly can, because I know that many performers out there are still not very experienced with it yet. They want to do it, but they feel like they're in very much unknown territory. So I'll recommend them to be like, okay, just start with a pickup, start with 1 or 2 effects, and then get an amplifier. And that's a great place to start and go from there. As far as the notation and how I strive to make everything look in my writing, I try to keep it as simple as possible. I try to keep it as traditional to the look of what we expect for sheet music. And much like we're augmenting the sound of the clarinet, I'm just slightly augmenting the look of the sheet music so that people can read it as they would most stuff. I'm just going to now notate it with effects when I need to add them in. And so to share with y'all a little bit of the supplemental packet up here on the screen, um, then I'm going to scroll all the way to the back, actually, um, just to give y'all a sense for how some of my solo writing looks. So you'll see like some boxed text to indicate when to switch the effects on and off. But for the most part, the music itself is going to run pretty traditionally. Um, and you'll notice, Evan, can you see my cursor move around actually?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. So you'll see like little like cue lines here um, for things, and we'll talk about that. But other than that, everything regarding the look of it is going to be pretty similar. So to get back into the whole screen sharing thing here for a second, I'm going to scroll more towards the beginning here and show y'all some examples of what I've seen in other parts of sheet music that you may see notated differently for effects. So if I'm using guitar pedals, each pedal has a set of knobs associated with it that's going to be in control of one particular parameter of that effect, whether it's delay time, how loud the effect is, how many repeats the delay has, that sort of thing. So there's a knob associated with each of these. And in some examples, you would see something like this, where at the beginning of the music, composer writes something for a specific pedal, and these are the specific pedal knob settings, basically, to give an indication of what the effect was meant to sound like. Um, as a visual learner, I particularly like this imagery. However, the problem with this is that if someone is using a different style of pedal, or say if they're using computer software to achieve these live effects, then this is where this can potentially cause a little bit of confusion in that regard, unless they're using the equipment specifically mentioned by the composer. Um, so for accessibility purposes, I tend to avoid this style of notation. Um, and then what we get instead is something like this, where to just put it really simply, I've got box text, arrow pointing to where I want it to be, and then effect type and the descriptors or parameters that I want to indicate for that particular effect. Um, Now, in some cases, like delay, which is an echo effect, a lot of performers find it useful to visualize how that delayed sound interacts with what they're currently playing. So when the sound comes back, where in the music are they? So in this case, you can add a line like this. So this little cue line down below is not something that I need to play. It's just letting me know here's what the delay is doing as I'm playing the upper line here. So it's almost kind of written as if it's a duet in a way. This is something I like to do for both delay and looping in particular, just so I can kind of see it from a almost like a chamber music sort of vantage point. Um, and I would say the nice thing about this system too is that, technology is constantly evolving. So even though we have a lot of different devices at our fingertips, it may all change and evolve over even the next like 10 or 20 years. So say as technology evolves, then the notation hopefully keeps it so that players can still go off of the same idea, but then just use different equipment for it. This would be the issue that I ran into with a lot of experimental effects pieces from like the 70s and 80s, where they were written for very specific types of like rack mounted equipment or computer software or something like that, with very specific interfaces and settings, so that when I try to perform the piece like 40 years later, the problem is that technology no longer exists unless I go to eBay and like find it for like $4,000. So that way I'm not feeling like I'm sticking my performer to any one particular brand or model of effect. Let's see here. Let's go into each of the effects specifically. So if I go into delay first, like I mentioned earlier, when people talk to me about like what are some really great effects to start off with from both the performer's standpoint and the composer's standpoint, I usually tend to mention delay first, just because for me it's one of the more versatile effects, and it's really nice to use whether or not you're using an external microphone or a pickup. It's a really friendly effect for a lot of different types of setups. And so, simply put, a delay is an echo. And the two parameters that I deal with are either going to be how much time does the device wait to echo the sound back, and then how many times does the sound echo back. So I'm dealing with two specific parameters, delay time as well as feedback, which is another term oftentimes in the guitar world for my number of repeats. How many times does that echo feedback to myself? And so just to demonstrate a little bit of this, what I'll do is play around with the delay time first. So we'll go ahead and turn this on, and right now it's set up to be about at a quarter note of 144, so it's going to be a pretty quick delay slapback. But say if I were to increase the delay time and want to spread out that effect even longer, then I could. Most delay pedals, if I'm using guitar effect pedals, have a max delay effect of somewhere in between half a second to a second long. Although there are some pedals and devices out there that can go well beyond that 1 second maximum. So this particular one that I'm using happens to be able to go up to like 6 seconds. But most performers you can expect to have a delay capability of under 1 second in terms of that delay time. On the other hand, on the other side of things, I can also play around with the number of times it repeats back. So I can either have it repeat back once and be done with it, or if I really want to just let everything mix together in just a pool of unending delays, then I also could do that. So for that reason, there's a lot of different sounds that you can create with delay, so that you can either have stuff repeated back and now you're kind of playing a duet with yourself and create harmony that way. Or if I just let the feedback run for a long time, I can just create a drone and let that just run for a little bit and continue just adding harmonies onto that. So when I'm notating delay, I'm just going to simply stick to those two parameters. So delay time, either listed in seconds, or a lot of times I'll notate it in a specific rhythmic value within the tempo. So say if I want my delay time to be a quarter note at 120 or an eighth note at 66, then sometimes you can see delay notated that way too. So like here would be an example of that here, where in that andante tempo, my delay time would be the dotted quarter. And then it feeds back 1 to 2 times. So all in all, this is going to be kind of a fun little syncopated delay, but then it's pretty short overall. So it's just going to repeat one or two times and then be done with it. So this would be an example, since it's a dotted quarter note delay, of me using delay to build rhythmic interplay and complexity. So this is an entirely a quarter note rhythm, but the delay all comes back on the offbeats, then that becomes a nice little like stereo ping-ponging effect, essentially, where I'm always on the downbeats and then my delay is always on the upbeats. And like I mentioned earlier, I usually like to add a little cue line beneath this, just to let my performer know vertically how all of this lines up with what they're currently doing, especially if it's a weird delay time like a 16th note or a dotted eighth or something like that, just so they can open their ears up to how that should line up. So this supplemental packet that was handed out virtually is a part of my effects notation packet that's available online, but I ended up adding a few examples to it specifically for this webinar. And one of these examples is from a book of etudes for clarinet and delay that I'm about to release called Delaytudes. And this is meant to take the performer through a number of different types of delay usage. So like for this first one, then notice how I don't really start kicking the delay on until measure 4. So it's going to start off pretty plain for the most part. And then once that delay kicks on, it's a quarter note delay. So the delay time is going to be that quarter note tempo of 144 to 160. And then it's going to repeat 5 to 6 times back. So it's going to sound like this. And then I've got little measures every now and then where I can indicate how all this lines up. So the point of this one is to kind of create little elements of a Hocket texture so that once eighth notes happen, then the delay immediately bounces those back in conversation. And there's a lot of upbeat and downbeat collisions as you go through this. And I went ahead and included the entire first etude so that y'all can follow along. I'm going to go ahead and play through this whole thing just so you can get a sense for how delay can be used just by itself. And if you go to measure 20, again, you can kind of see that idea that instead of me just playing eighth notes constantly, I can divvy up the duty to have the delay fill in the gaps, let the performer breathe a little bit, but also create that sort of fun ping-ponging effect left to right, basically, between your acoustic sound and the electric sound. So I'll go ahead and get out of this for a moment so that we can play through this. the fun thing with these two is it really challenges the players. Oh, volume. Part of the fun thing with these two is that they really challenge the player's inner sense of time. So one of the ways that you can use this again is kind of like a duet, basically, so that the player has to be really careful about the strictness of their offbeats and onbeats and offbeats, so that it can effectively slot just right with their past self, basically. Now, on the flip side, another way to use delay is to kind of take it out of time a little bit and create more of an ambient texture. So in this case, with the next example immediately following this in the packet, then what happens is that it is an eighth note delay. It does fit specifically in with the tempo, but in this case, it's meant to create more of kind of a shimmering underlying texture. And then over the top of that, what happens is that you're able to place notes in an upper register to now create a rippling accompanying line and let that delay for a little bit, and then just place little upper notes up in the top, so that with the amount of stuff that's being delayed, you can kind of stack like a left hand and right hand effect in the piano. So looking at measure 5 of this one, then you'll notice that there are eighth notes at the top marked with tenutos to be our melody line. But then underneath that, you're going to have all these rippling sextuplets that are just going to keep repeating and burbling underneath. In measure 2, I've included one of these cue lines again, which is a fun way of showing how a delay can create a staggered breathing sort of effect. So as I continue letting the sextuplets ripple, then I can breathe, but then that sound is still going to keep carrying on. So it's not going to create a weird, awkward gap as I need to like refill my lungs and then keep going from there. So for a performer, then this is one of the nice benefits of using delay unaccompanied. And I think I've got this one set up correctly in the pedal. I'll go ahead and play through this one too. So the delay in this case is a little bit longer since it's an eighth note within a 63 to 66 tempo. But there's only like 2 to 3. I think this one's almost more like 4. But it is a shorter repeat overall than the first etude. And so here is the effect of those rippling sextuplets. I'll fix that here in a second. But here's those sextuplets. And then what'll happen here in a second is that the melody is going to now start to separate itself from that. Okay, sorry, that crashing sound was my laptop suddenly dropping on the stand. All right, so here's all of that second delaytude. And so, again, you've kind of got an ambient usage and a little bit more of a playful sort of architecture like usage. Delay's got so many possibilities to it. And so, usually, this is why this effect takes, for me, the most time to talk about and the most time to figure out like how to write it. Um, and so, if you can stick to that sort of simplicity of box text with delay time, number of repeats, and then finding a way to write in a cue line to let your performer know, hey, this is how your past self interacts with you, then performers enjoy this effect quite a lot too. And so I'm really excited to release this book later because I know that there are a lot of people that are excited about getting into this sort of stuff for the first time. Now, to go ahead and talk about some of the other effects a little bit, let's go into pitch shifting next. So this is going to involve me skipping over a little bit for a moment. Okay, so with pitch shifting for our commission composers, we stuck to an octave on this one, I believe. Um, but the essence
I
with
think it
pitch,
was actually there's like 7 or 8 intervals we chose
okay,
from.
did we add all of them? Okay.
Maybe.
Um, I can't remember honestly, but essentially the idea with pitch shifting is that I can take the pitch that goes into the pedal and I can tell it to shift up or down a certain number of semitones depending on what the pedal is capable of. So like this brown one down here is an octave pedal. So it has two options to either shift the pitch down one octave or even add the second octave below that as well. Other pitch shifters like this one give you some of the options in between. So I can shift any number of semitones up or down. If I wanted to be extra crunchy about it and make it shift the minor second, I could. Or just an earful of tritones, whatever you wanted to do in that case. Um, and so for that reason, when I'm notating pitch, then I'll notate it like this, where I'll say pitch, but then minus or plus the number of semitones I want to go. So if it's minus 12, that's going to give me the octave, um, so on and so forth. There are some examples of music that I've seen do multiple pitch shifting. So you would have it go like up the third, but then down the fifth to create full on like triadic harmony there. Um, and so, again, just in the name of trying to keep it simple and consistent, then I'll just usually write this as a minus or plus number to give me that idea. Um, as an extra example, I went ahead and included my arrangement of box Toccata and Fugue, just because one of the ways that pitch shifting can be really cool on clarinet is especially to go outside of its normal range. So for an octave pedal specifically, if I wanted to like channel a little bit of inner bass clarinet or even contra, um, then I could, and it adds a lot of depth to the sound. Um, so just to briefly give you all a sound taste of this. Okay. So So octave is one of the more satisfying ones to me, with like bass clarinet being my favorite auxiliary instrument. It's just so satisfying to be able to get that extra like push down the octave or push down 2 octaves even. Um, so different pedals have different capabilities, and as you work with performers specifically, you might want to get to know their pitch shifting abilities a little bit, because not every pedal can do all of the different semitones. Um, so it'd be one of those things where you could specify minor sixth, all that sort of stuff. But there are quite a few pedals that can do it.
Chris, it cut out for just a second, right as
Okay.
you were starting
Okay.
that thought
Um, Dang. Okay. Is it
about working with performers.
okay? Yeah. So about working with performers to get to know their specific equipment a little bit. So if they have a pitch shifter, what are its capabilities? An octave is usually the most common one. So as I'm working with performers, I can usually expect to at least know that their pitch shifter can at least do an octave up or down. Though there are some examples of equipment, many examples of equipment that can do the semitones in between. Um, and then going on to probably the effect that was my personal favorite when I got into this side of clarinet performance because I'm just a huge classic rock nerd, and that was distortion. So when I'm notating distortion, this is going to be, looks like page 8 of the packet. Um, Distortion is essentially like your sound of rock. Like it's that sound really overdriven to the max to the point where it starts to break up and it gives you that sort of like dirty, gritty sort of sound that you typically hear in your any just about any rock album ever. So when I first started getting into this sort of thing, it was like, okay, cool. How can I get to sound like Brian May from Queen or like Joe Perry from Aerosmith? Like I want a taste of that. Um, and so, of course, it's a clarinet, so distortion is going to affect it differently than it would an electric guitar. But the concept is still the same, that you're overdriving the sound to the point where it starts to break up and become a little nasty, but in a good way. So when I'm notating distortion, there's three basic categories of it. You have overdrive, which would be if you're if you're likening this to like styles of hot sauces, this is your mild. So like it's just enough that you can tell it's going to start to have a little bit of grit in it, but for the most part, it's going to preserve the sound of the clarinet. Um, and then it starts to get more overdriven from there. So when you classify your classic distortion, this is my medium versus my mild. So distortion is it really starts to take on that sound of dirty and gritty. And this is where we start to take the clarinet slightly across genre lines a little bit, and we start to give it that sort of rock-esque sort of tone. Now, I could go one step beyond that and go into what we call a fuzz effect, which is going to keep intensifying that, and it's a pretty actually funny self-explanatory sort of term. So it's going to be very fuzzy in nature. And so when I'm notating all of this, I'll classify it simply as either overdrive, distortion, or fuzz. So in this case, I'll notate it in my box text simply like that. I don't have to put like a specific number or parameter in there. Pretty much I can just go off of the feeling that I want to create and then let my performer come up with the equipment to be able to do that, essentially. Um, and for me personally, what I love to do is combine distortion and pitch shifting quite a bit. So if I were to take that fuzz and then combine it with an octave down effect, and this is where I started to get addicted to this thing, where it was like, okay, now I can treat this like a clarinet. It's still going to play the same, but now my sounds are just kind of like completely off in a different direction. which for a performer is super satisfying and very fun to play around with. And this is where I get into some of my compositions like Demo, which is at the end of this packet, which really relies on that really heavy pitch shifted down with distortion. And now it sounds a little bit more like a bass guitar meets like an 8-bit synthesizer kind of effect. And so thankfully we can keep the notation here pretty simple. Modulation. Let's talk about modulation for a second. So for the purposes of this call for scores, we stuck it to chorus. So with your modulation effects, so we'd be talking about, there we are. So chorus, flanger, vibrato, tremolo. All of these are your more sort of subtle textural effects that are going to create slight time and pitch fluctuations to add texture and depth to the sound. So when we talk about an effect such as chorus, you're thickening the texture to give that sort of impression that it's like a chorus of one clarinet, that it's going to sound a little bit out of time and a little bit out of tune, to give it a shimmery quality. So okay. So say if I were to go back to the slower Delaytude, but say if I wanted to add texture and depth to it, I'll go ahead and kick on the chorus effect as well to make it a little bit more ambient and almost dreamlike in nature. And that would be sort of on your milder side, but I could go even crazier with it and make it even more kind of crunchy and shimmery.
Hey,
And
Chris,
that's, yeah.
would you be okay trying it out without the delay pedal? I think it's a
Oh,
little
totally.
difficult to hear.
Yeah, for sure. A la sort of like Debussy or Ravel kind of sort of sound. Um, did that sound a little more clear?
Yeah, I think it was easier to pick up on
Okay.
more of the texture change.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So in this case, again, it's kind of boiling it down to notating it to a feeling and how thick or mild you want it to be, and it doesn't need to be a specific parameter. Any of your modulation effects could be like this. So if I wanted to be a thick chorus, I can just simply describe it as such and let my performer tweak their equipment to match that sound, or slow vibrato, or anything like that. It can be a little bit more, I hate to say the term vague, but y'all probably get what I'm talking about, that it doesn't need to be scientifically accurate when I notate it. But this is one that I'll commonly just kind of like sprinkle as an optional effect in some of my music, to be like, this is going to be mainly delay based and distortion based, but if you wanted to add texture and more of a dreamy sound to it, go ahead and feel free to slap a chorus effect on there too. And that's perfectly okay for me to think about when I'm writing, just so that I'm not requiring composers to be like, you have to have these 4 specific effects. I can be like, okay, it mainly uses these 2, but if you wanted to get further into it, you can add this one too. And that's a nice sort of thing to think about from an accessibility perspective, and that opens up opportunities for more performers to feel like they can tackle the piece without feeling like they need to go to Guitar Center and buy like half a dozen pedals. And then To finish off our more simple notation effects, we've got reverb. And again, you can just describe this one more kind of based on a feeling. That all I'm doing is simply, there we go. All I'm doing is just emulating like a large hall, or just adding a little bit of reverb to the space, especially if I'm performing in a really dry venue. It's just nice for adding a little bit of atmosphere and a little bit of ring. And I can describe that really simply too. Whether I wanted to just be barely there, or I could just lay on the reverb like crazy and just let it keep kind of shimmering off into the distance for like 5 seconds or something like that. Almost like church cathedral like. And then that leaves us with our last effect, which is honestly one of the funkier ones to try and notate. So this is why I especially wanted to include this packet to give you all an idea of exactly how I do this, which is looping. So the idea with looping is that I'm taking a recorded snippet of sound and I'm telling the pedal, hey, let's keep that, and then just keep putting it on a loop for a while. So I'll tell my performer when to start the loop, when to end the loop, and then it's just going to keep playing back. Now, I could just stick to that, and now the performer can play on top of that loop and improvise or do whatever I want them to do. Or I can keep stacking layers on top of that loop. So just about every loop pedal has 3 basic functions to notate, and that's to record, so when to start the loop, when to end the loop, or in most cases, start the playback. And then to keep stacking from there, then there's an overdub mode that I can specify as well. And so to give a simpler example of this from the packet and notation in page 11, then I've got the box text to tell me when to record, but I've got a little bracket to tell me how long that loop is going to be. So in this case, this is going to be a 2-measure loop that then repeats back. And in the case of this bright red pedal that I'm using off here in the corner, I'm going to tap it once for the record, and then I'm going to tap it again to just send it directly into that playback mode. And then it's just going to keep going however long I want it to go. And once again, I've got a cue line down below to let my performer know, hey, here's what's happening as you now stop playing. And you just let the playback run for a little bit. Now, if I wanted to include an overdub mode, then I could. So I'll simply put box text and an arrow to tell my performer when to do that. And then now what's going to happen is I'm just going to keep stacking harmonies from here. And what's cool about an overdub mode is that as long as I let the loop run, it's just going to keep stacking and stacking and stacking, so that okay, let's do it this way. So first I would set up my loop. And then we go into overdub. Until I tell the looper to stop. And here's the really nice benefit of having that cue line is now I can visualize how all this harmony just continues to stack and stack and stack until I tell it to stop or erase the loop, whatever I need to do. So composers like Mark Mellitz, for example, use looper quite a bit in a couple of his compositions. And for those that are writing for this sort of effect, then I would stick to basically these three simple ideas of record, playback, and overdub. And from there, if you wanted to do something more, then that's where you would want to work with your performer specifically to figure out what their delay pedal, or sorry, their looper pedal is capable of. Because there are some loopers that are actually kind of crazy in terms of their functionality. Some allow you to record like different tracks and stack on top of those individual tracks simultaneously and take in out some of the layers individually. But in the case of most loopers, it's going to be I set the loop and then I just keep stacking from there until I tell it to stop. But this gives a really cool impression for the listener of kind of a one-man band kind of effect with one player. So I can not just stack harmony, but I could do any of this with different rhythms too, and create rhythmic complexity from layer to layer as I keep stacking that up. In the case of the musical example in the back of the packet, then what I do is I use a loop in this case to record a one measure loop and then just let that run as a sort of rhythm section, so to speak. And then I'm just going to keep doing all of this stuff while the loop is present. And so before we go into some Q&A stuff here for a second, I do want to share with y'all the very end of demo, the piece that I wrote, just because I want to talk through each of these settings as it happens. And so let me see if it'll let me do this. Desktop. Okay. This should, I think, share sound as well. Evan, can you let me know if you hear this? No? Okay.
Not, it's very quiet actually. I think I heard it, but like, it's like very, very, very little.
Just very, very little. Share, advanced sharing options. Oh, share sound. There we go. Let's do that. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. So let's do this then. So this is going to run for a little bit. And this is eventually going to become my loop. Loop starts here. And this is going to be a 4-bar loop. Then playback mode starts here. And this loop is just going to run for a little bit. And then overdub mode kicks in here. So this is my second layer. Third layer. So again, every time the loop restarts again, it's going to allow me to stack a new layer. Fourth layer. And then it's just going to finish out from here. So looping can be a really versatile effect to use. It just takes a little bit more experimentation to figure out how to notate it exactly the way you want to. But that's where especially I hope that notation packet at least gives y'all a starting guide to figure out how to start experimenting with it yourselves. And then, of course, like my website has resources, like I have a contact page and all that sort of stuff. So if y'all are like starting to write for looping and you're like, am I doing this right? You could always reach out to me too, and I'd be happy to talk about this sort of stuff too. Like I said, I really enjoy helping not just performers but composers out with, continuing to gain this interest in the performance realm. But as far as our call for scores and all that sort of stuff, those were the effects that we stuck to, and this was ultimately kind of the main half dozen effects that most composers end up writing for nowadays. There are other effects out there too, like synthesizer effects and full on harmonizer sort of things. Um, but I at least wanted to give you all a taste of it, so to speak.
Chris,
Um,
could you cover that volume pedal too? I think it
oh,
just
yeah,
provides like a
for sure.
couple. Yeah, yeah, the fadeaways are good to know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the octave pedal down here, or sorry, the volume pedal down here in the bottom right, is essentially like the volume knob on an electric guitar. It allows me to fade in and out of the sound whenever I want to either just use purely acoustic clarinet sound, and then I can fade the effects in and out from there. Um, and I can fine tune that. So in this case, say if I were to just demonstrate with an octave. Then even though I'm keeping all the same dynamic level all the way across, now my volume pedal has an extra way to fine tune my effects. So in this case, I've got this at the very beginning of my signal chain so that when I cut it all the way off, when my foot's off the gas, so to speak, there is no effects whatsoever. And then I can just keep easing that in and out whenever I need to. The notation packet actually has a way to notate this. And I had to experiment with this quite a bit because I couldn't really find examples of it. So I kind of just had to make up something, and hopefully this sticks. So that I use it as um, a dotted crescendo and decrescendo system. So this lets my performer know that I'm not changing my air volume, I'm changing the effect volume. Um, so I wanted to be distinct enough, but I wanted to feel familiar to the performer to be like, oh, this is a volume notation. It's just purely electric volume. Um, and then I've got empty circles and full circles to let my performer know when I'm fully off the gas or fully on it. And now there's just full effects going throughout. Um, so in demo, you see actually that quite a bit of that where I'm using this, but then the empty circles, full circles, and all that's just volume pedal in that case. I think I've only ever seen like one other example so far where someone like actually notates a volume pedal.
Was
And
it from me in that wind
actually two
ensemble
examples in that
sketch?
case. Yeah, so I guess
Okay.
it was from you, and then Jason Alder did a piece for electrified concert bass clarinet that used a volume pedal as well. Um, and that notation was kind of wild. It was a little bit more like a graphic score sort of look to it. But thank you. I almost forgot to do that. Um, so I know we started a few minutes after one, so I would say, Evan, if it's okay with you, like, do we have a few minutes for questions?
Yeah, I mean, as long as everyone is here and
Yeah.
has stuff to ask, I'd say um, if you just like raise your hand or like send me a message saying you have a question. I don't know, like for the people that don't want to turn on their microphone, you can
Oh,
just
for sure.
direct message me or Chris, and if you just like raise your hand on the video, I'll request to unmute you.
Or let me actually go ahead and bring up the chat too, so people can just put it in the chat as well.
We'll get Ludwig over here.
Okay.
Hello, everyone,
Hi,
and thank you
Ludwig.
for doing this webinar, Chris. It's really interesting. My question, can you understand me good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. My question is about the effect pedals. How do I right? Because the sequence in which I put the pedals makes quite a difference, right?
It can,
Because
yes.
so how do I make that clear in my score on what do I want to have first and what do I want to have last?
Sure. That's a great question. So, um, let me see if I can pull something like that up. Oh, you know what? It's not in here. Okay. Um, Let me grab an example real quick. Okay. So this is something that I can put in the sort of introductory notes to the score. And what I can do, this is from Mark Malitz's Dark Matter for electroacoustic bass clarinet. And what he does in this case is he actually goes with full-on images in this case to let my performer know, okay, here's my chain of effects from the very, very beginning all the way through the end. Because you're absolutely right. Like if I change the order of, say, like where my distortion and octave pedals go, then I could have an octave sound feeding into the distortion, or I can have a distorted sound now being dropped down the octave, which is going to be a slight sound difference. So you can either do something like this, or I'll simply just like either replace the images with like box text with each of my effects and potentially save myself a little bit of ink too while I'm at it. So just to be like, okay, distortion runs into pitch, then runs into delay, so on and so forth.
And if you're
Uh,
one of the commission people that's working with Chris and I, or even if you just like ever want to email, I'm sure, and ask like, how does this pedal being here in the chain versus here affect the
mhm.
sound? And it, you know, especially with like my Helix board, it could really quickly be arranged and like just output how those differences sound. So you're more than welcome to like send an
Mhm.
email and ask
All right.
to get some clarification on, you know, if you're really wanting to know how the your sound structure kind of
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
I mean, if no one else has a question, I would have another question.
Sure.
Right, about performance, because like if I perform the thing live, I will have my clarinet sound and the recorded sound. So it's
Yes.
an addition of two. And if I just record it at home, do you also add a dry sound of the clarinet, or do you just use the recorded of the pedals?
Yeah. Let me take you on a tour here to show you how exactly I'm even recording this webinar. Um, so in this case, I've got my mics in front of here for the acoustic sound, but then I've got another mic in front of my PA that allows me to adjust the levels of how I'm picking up both sides. Um, and so for performers performing this sort of music too, um, then they'll want to keep in consideration like where they put the PA so that the audience can hear equally both the acoustic sound and the electric sound. So the way I normally set up my PA when I'm performing this sort of stuff is almost like the PA is my duet partner, so to speak. So I'll set the PA off to the side, I'll be on the other side, and both of them are going to be aimed at the audience. Um, just so that that balance is equal in that case.
Yeah, and because we'll be in like real spaces when we perform this stuff, like
Yeah,
it's on the performers to kind of get those like balance levels, and I think we'll
yeah,
have like an audio person. So I mean, it still fits into if you're in a church, it'll sound boomy. But yeah, the speaker is your second player in that
yeah.
sense.
I used to have one mic set up in between the two, and I would have myself and the PA pointed at one mic, essentially. Um, but what I found out is that they both kind of needed their own separate input levels. Um, Otherwise, the PA would have to be turned up really loud, and all of a sudden I'm blasting my eardrums out, kind of thing, in order to
One
get the sound level.
one thought I had that's an important like performance consideration
Mm-hmm.
is that these pedals, specifically in this like pedal format, like you see in the bottom right corner, they are kind of like set when you're playing. Like Chris, unless it's on like a loop mode and he can like duck down and like
Mm-hmm.
change the pedals during the piece. they're all kind of
Hmm.
stuck at the setting. Like you can't change the delays, uh, like quarter note to an eighth note during the middle of the piece. It has to be done like when there's silence. So yeah, I mean that's an important consideration. In my
Hmm.
multi-effects like line 6 Helix board, I can program like I press this button and all these different parameters switch. But for the general player that is going to have like just a delay pedal or just an octave pedal, those parameters cannot switch unless you physically get down and move them.
Right. So when I'm doing any sort of changing of effects throughout writing a piece, for the most part, it's almost entirely going to be like turn this effect off, turn this effect on, and then
Mhm.
off, and then switch to this effect. Because at that point, it's just a matter of my feet just hitting different buttons. And now I'm basically playing like DDR and clarinet at the same time, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So I'm just dealing with my feet.
Yeah, so there is a limitation in that sense, but there's still like so much expanded possibility that like you have 6 pedals, they're all set to their own specific like parameters, and then the way that you turn them all off and on at specific points, or like, you'll mix distortion and delay in this one section, but turn off distortion and turn on modulation in a different section. Like there's still a lot more sounds to play with than just acoustic clarinet solo.
Yeah. And basically, when I want to switch an effect off, again, it comes down to box text. So I'll just be like, okay, box text with an arrow, delay, off, and then go on from there. In to continue the name of keeping it simple. Is there a length limit to creating the initial loop? Um, so Sarah just put in the chat here if there's a length limit to creating the initial loop. No, in most cases. Like a lot of times, like a lot of looper pedals will just tell you, hey, we can record up to like 15 minutes or something like that if you wanted to. But that's an important thing to point out though, that when I start stacking on top of that initial loop, every layer is going to be the same length as the initial loop. So if I set a 5-second loop, every layer on top of that's going to be 5 seconds long, so on and so forth.
Uh, yeah, just asked you to unmute yourself. Unlocked.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Is it audible? Okay, right. I'm wondering about the way your pickup works. Does it
Mm-hmm.
pick up the sound of like noises the instrument creates, something like key clicks or perhaps breathing sounds, air sound, singing into it or something like that?
It absolutely can. So on the bottom of my board, you can't see it. It's tucked underneath. Is a noise gate pedal, so it's purposely drowning out any of the key clicks and breath sounds that you might hear, especially when the distortion's kicked on. Because when you're just distorting like just white noise, basically, this is where it starts to get a little hissy. But if I wanted to make use of that, and say if I wanted to, create percussive elements with my key clicks or breath sounds, then I could.
Especially turning on like delay for it. That can get cool.
Yes. Okay. Let me play around for a second. Or honestly, even if it's distorted, you can kind of talk into it a little bit too.
And even when you get like pitch shift involved, it can do like even like crazier stuff.
Like that. One of these days I do want to do that sort of stuff where it's like if I just like distort some key clicks and then put a loop on it and then just basically like add like a rhythmic background and then I start playing on top of that, there is a really cool possibility for that.
Oh yeah.
Definitely.
I'll probably be doing some stuff like that for the improv stuff on my recital. I'm a little scared to like notate it specifically, but
Let me know how that goes. I'm curious to see what that ends up looking like if you do
Oh, you'll be there.
that. Great questions, y'all. Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Yeah, we got
Final
one.
one again.
That was super cool. Thank you for demonstrating that. Also, if you don't mind, maybe can you demonstrate some sort of multiphonic sounds
Oh,
or the
okay.
ranges of the multiphonics, like the soft one, the distorted, crunchy ones, or something like that?
Okay. Um, let's see. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave the noise gate off for this one too, just to make sure it picks up everything. Um, but say if I added, say if I've got delay, chorus, and reverb all on. I'm trying to think of multiphonic fingerings off the top of my head, but so there's a certain element to the multiphonics being able to be picked up as well.
And I think a bit of that is just like it's clipping over Zoom, but if you were to be in a real like hall where the speaker is like it's not clipping, that can be a sound that is like it does sound unique and different than
Yes.
just like a normal clarinet doing it.
Basically, like a lot of your um, outside noise, so to speak, and a lot of the extended effects that you can do, for the most part, they carry over pretty well. In fact,
Uh,
glissando sounds really cool with a delay.
I will ask Cameron.
Hello.
Hello.
Um, I was curious if I don't want to take away from anyone else's question opportunities, but I was curious if I could ask some performance perspectives instead of composer perspective questions.
Sure.
Because I actually am kind of like I'm getting started in all of this. I've been doing it for about a year.
Cool.
But I came today because I was like, I have no clue how to notate this. So that's why I was like, I thought this would be helpful.
Yeah.
But I was curious, for your noise gate, right? I'm still
Yeah.
kind of learning about noise gate stuff. Like, what do you have it set to, or like, what kind of noise gate do you use to help eliminate key click stuff? Because that's something I'm struggling with in my
Okay.
endeavors.
Okay. I'll go ahead and turn it back on just to kind of demonstrate this. So what I'm going to do, just so you can really, really hear it, I'm going to turn the distortion back on, just so it's a little more sensitive to it. And what I'll do with the noise gate is I'll set it down at the minimum, so it's not really taking anything out at that point. But then I'll keep Hold on, I think I accidentally unplugged something. Okay. So I'll start at the minimum, and then I'm going to keep increasing the knob and the threshold until the point where I stop hearing the key click sounds.
Okay, so you basically just kind of like playing by ear.
Yeah. And usually once I've reached that point where I stop hearing the key click, I'll just leave the noise gate where it is, and then I'll just keep it on all the time, unless I want those key clicks to be there.
And you found that that rule of thumb has pretty much helped with any like even if you need to play softly, you've kind of found that still helps
Yeah,
eliminate
and say
that.
if I wanted to go like 5 Ps or something like that, I can always use that as another test too, to just kind of like hold it for a little bit and then play with the knob as I do that too to see like when is the point that it starts to cut out because of the
Okay.
noise gate.
And
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, it's a lot.
you'll get to mess with it before like jumping on stage and performing that.
Oh yeah.
Exactly.
That
So it's kind
yeah.
of a playing by ear and fine tuning, basically.
Okay. Um, my own. I have like a couple other questions, as long as I'm not taking from anyone else. Um,
I
my,
think you're good. If someone else raises their hand or something, I'll
okay.
it's fine. You
Um,
can
do do you have any particular like absolute favorite pedals for either the soprano or bass clarinet? Because I know you kind of have to be choosy in terms of the with in terms of bass because sometimes the frequencies aren't always picked up
Sure.
the best.
Yeah. So like um, for delay, I haven't really encountered any issues yet of
Okay.
frequency difference. So like all the delay pedals that I've encountered like have been pretty universally good for both instruments. So like this white one that I'm using over here, the Joyo D-Seed, and there's a sequel
Hmm.
to it too, the D-Seed 2. Um, that one is personally one of my favorites just because of that expanded delay time capability, because it's able to do up to 6 seconds.
Nice.
Um, and then, because I've encountered a couple pieces like Shauna Pevelo's Circle Play 3 has a two, no, Circle Play 1 has a 2 measure delay in it, which is like 3.5 seconds worth of time. Really cool example of delay writing, but there were very few like guitar pedals that could go for that long. So this one was affordable. It was like $60, I think, on Reverb. So
Yeah.
it's got that max delay time. It has 2 different presets to it as well.
Oh,
So if I
nice.
wanted to switch settings in the middle of a piece, that made it really easy because I could just tap the preset button and it switches to the other preset without me having to like bend down and tweak knobs.
Nice.
Um, and then it's got a few other modes and stuff on there too, but like for me, it's like my one all end all delay pedal that allows me to pretty much tackle anything in the current repertoire.
Okay.
As far as
Awesome.
like other ones go, like pitch shifting, I found is usually like the weirder one in terms of like being picked up by clarinet or bass clarinet. Um, but for soprano, I haven't really had any issues with this one. So it's the Boss Super Octave OC3. I the one that I find picks up really well is this one actually. So I think they just
Oh
started
yeah.
making it again, the TC Electronic Brainwaves. This
Yeah.
gives me a lot of different pitch shift options, and it picks up the sound of the soprano clarinet and bass clarinet like stupidly well.
Okay.
Um,
I know I was
so
reading
like,
some reviews. I was a little concerned because it said sometimes it seems like this sucks the soul out of the sound, but I also realize I'm reading that from a guitarist perspective and not a wind perspective. I was like, I don't
sure.
know, but I was like, whatever, you know.
Well, and one of the things I'll mention to performers especially is like because these effects react so differently to us than with guitar or bass guitar, then I'll have them like just go out to whatever music stores they can find first and just bring their pickup in and just ask the Guitar Center employees or whoever to be like, yo, is there like a room or a corner that I can just plug into an amp and try some stuff out?
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
don't think I've ever run into a situation where they tell me no. They just
Nice.
typically ask me, "Do you have the cable and the pickup?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And then from there, they've got the amp and the pedals to try stuff
Okay.
out.
Awesome. Then I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Um, and then my last question was just your opinions of I see you have the Boss looper, right?
Yeah.
Is do you find you like that one the best out of a couple, like I'm assuming the ones you've tried or looked at?
Um, I like it a lot. The only limitation to it is just naturally because of its construction that stopping and erasing are a little finicky. So, like, if I wanted
Hmm.
to switch modes, that's a single tap of the pedal. But if I wanted to stop the loop, not erase it, but just stop it, I have to double tap it,
Mm-hmm.
which sometimes is kind of a pain in the butt.
Okay.
And I've missed the double tap every now and then. Now, in this case, I have an external foot switch for it, that allows me to
Okay.
single tap the stop function.
Oh, that's nice.
Um,
Oh,
but other than that,
And on my Helix board, you can like link it to something like Loopy on the iPad, and then the different foot switches on the Helix board can be assigned via MIDI commands. So they
mhm.
each like pedal board switch will, start it, erase it, overdub it.
mm-hmm. Okay.
Um, and it looks like
Awesome.
we've got one other question here too about the pitch shifter. Does it copy the original signal and add the interval, or do you just hear the interval? Um, and in most cases, you can adjust this actually. So, like with this octave pedal, the very left knob here, the direct level, um, if I turn it all the way counterclockwise, then that's just going to be the interval. So any sound that's going to feed into the pedals after that is just going to be the octave. But if I turn it all the way the other direction, and now direct is all the way at the very top, or sometimes this is like a mix knob instead, then that's going to mix both your dry and your wet signal, so to speak. And if I run that into a distortion, it's going to distort both the original sound and the octave below. And most pedals have this capability, so that you can fine tune how much of the original signal you want.
And the original signal will always be there because you're a clarinet player. I mean,
Right.
assuming you're in a live space. So if you
Yeah.
don't also like, yeah, I think I've messed around a couple times with like just the pitch shift is the thing that's getting the effects going through the speaker. So there's always me, and then the speaker is always just like exclusively the sounds and no original clarinet going through.
Yeah, in fact, I can demonstrate this for a split second. That what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the direct level completely down, running the pitch shifter into the distortion. So what you'll hear first is just the octave being distorted, and then we're going to add in the original signal too. So as you turn that knob up, you can start to hear the original A now start to be distorted a little bit too, and not just that one. I'll go ahead and do the octave below too. Well, C.
And I think it's like slightly hard to hear because you're not
Yeah.
actually amplifying your like original clarinet sound
Mm-hmm.
right now, but um, I
Basically,
mean,
it starts to
probably
bring
with
in
this Zoom setup, it's a little bit harder to hear, but
probably. That's the gist at least. There we go. Okay. Multi-oscillator synth. Yep. And that's been fun with like some of these older Bill Smith pieces that are meant to be very synthesizer like trying to come up with a combination of these pedals that can replicate that. Um, and it's possible. It just takes a lot of trial and error to figure out the sound you want.
okay, well, I have to get going, and
Okay.
uh, I guess I'll listen to Cameron's real quick question, and then we'll
Yeah,
jump
and then
out.
we'll wrap it up.
I was just gonna ask if I could add one small thing.
Yeah.
I found because I'm I'm still getting used to all this stuff. I found like if anyone else is curious about it but doesn't want to immediately jump into all of the crazy price stuff, I just bought a MultiFX just to start.
Mhm.
Yes.
And I know it's kind of hit or miss and there's different things obviously, but it was a great way to not have to spend a whole bunch of money to figure
Oh
out
yeah,
kind of what I want something to sound like.
Yeah.
Um,
that was my
that
direction too.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's convenient for like space saving and stuff too. Everything's all just in one package. Um, And for all of y'all that are looking for different ways that the clarinet can be modified like this in ways that we haven't heard today, um, there's a lot of stuff on my YouTube channel right now, and it's going to continue building onto that. So like within the next month here, I should have a video entirely dedicated to bass clarinet stuff. Um, so there'll be resources to at least kind of hear how some of these sounds interact with clarinet versus all of your electric guitar demos that are just there's a plethora of them on YouTube.
And all of this isn't even touching the world of like actual like digital manipulation and stuff. I think this is
Right.
like really like foot in the door level like access to electroacoustic sounds. And these are just some of like the ways that as classical trained musicians we can just like you know not take it to like the max, but like get our foot in the door, get our feet wet, and like just make some more sounds than are currently possible when we just play acoustic,
Yeah,
without getting like super duper duper technical. Like a lot of this is just plug and plug and play.
for sure. Um, but yeah, thank y'all so much for being here. It's been great to talk about this stuff with all of y'all. And again, if y'all have questions, feel free to reach out to either Evan or I, like at any time. Like I'm happy to talk about this stuff with people whenever they run into those issues because I know that I definitely had like a ton of questions when I first started too, of just kind of like, oh, this sounds really weird. How do I get that to sound better? Kind of thing.
Yeah,
And sometimes
and
it's just a
that's
tweak of a knob.
it's kind of cool with Chris coming out with his Delaytudes book and like more people getting interested, especially with like starting to play like delay pedal clarinet is like that's an avenue for composers with like a limited amount of repertoire that is existing for that instrument to just like kind of start writing something for it, and like you're much more likely to have someone interested in being like, well, what else can I play with delay pedals? And it's a good time, um you know, just to like start learning about the instrument and maybe writing some type of piece that you can add it to your repertoire catalog.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much,
Cool.
guys. It means a lot. This video will be archived on my YouTube channel if you ever want to reference back. I have from Chris on my website. I'll also put it in like a resource page, but like little tiny clips of the different pedals that specifically the commission composers are using to just like real quick reference and see what the pedal is and like a close-up picture. So that'll be available for everyone. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks for being here. And yeah, it was great to meet all of you. Thank you.
Thank y'all.